Hi, good afternoon, and welcome to the Jewish Federation of Greater Portland's weekly Wednesday briefing on perspectives on pride in a changing time. My name is Rachel Nelson. My pronouns are she, hers, and I am the Director of Educational Initiatives and Intergroup Outreach here at Federation. Just a few quick housekeeping notes. This webinar is being recorded and the chat has been turned off. Please utilize the Q&A feature to ask questions of our panelists. So this month marks the 50th anniversary of the first Pride March that happened in New York City in 1970. And I wanted to share a little bit about how the Jewish Federation got involved with Pride and the Jewish LGBT community in the last several years. In 2016, Jewish Federations of North America sponsored a Pride mission to Israel, and we had 7 community members from our Jewish community attend. When they returned from this trip, they were galvanized and wanted to share their experiences. They were also members of our community who were heavily involved in different synagogues and other Jewish organizations in town. And they recognized that not everyone was having the same experience in the community and wanted to work collaboratively with the community to both share their welcoming experiences and help do internal audits with organizations to find out in ways, areas in which our community could improve. We formed a group, the group Jewish Pride Greater PDX, to represent synagogues and other Jewish organizations across Greater Portland and Southwest Washington, across the Greater Portland and Southwest Washington community. We decided that one of the first things we wanted to do was march under a Jewish banner at Pride. In June of 2017, over 250 members of the Jewish community marched together. It was an incredible experience. And the cheers we heard from the crowd and the mazel tovs and the shaloms that were shared were priceless. We've marched every year since then, and we were all set to march again this year. But along with everyone else, we pivoted. And this previous Shabbat, we hosted a Pride Unity Shabbat candle lighting with over 100 community members. We do look forward to marching together in person next year at Pride PDX. So I'm delighted now to introduce our panelists for today. We'll hear from each of them and then have a chance to ask questions. As a reminder, please use the Q&A feature. So I first want to introduce Debra Porta, the Executive Director of Pride Northwest. Pronouns are she, her, and hers. She has been actively engaged with Pride Northwest as a volunteer, as board president from 2007 to 2015, and now as the Executive Director since 2006. Under Debra's leadership, Pride Northwest, as home to the annual Portland Pride Festival and Parade, has grown into a nationally recognized Pride organization. Originally from Dallas, Texas, Debra studied at Portland State University, receiving her master's in public administration with a specialization in nonprofit management. Debra strongly believes in the power of Pride as far more than a single event or even a month of events. A dedication to inclusion and a respect for all of the identities that make up our community underscores Debra's approach to community engagement and to Pride. When not living Pride, Debra lives in North Portland with her wife and 4-legged children, supporting and advising various grassroots community groups. Our second speaker after Debra will be Rabbi Debra Kolodny, pronouns they, them, has been pursuing justice as a spiritual activist since 1981. After 35 years leading unions, queer and Jewish organizations, they are now the spiritual leader of Portland's Unshul and the executive director at Portland United Against Hate. Debra's activism has included producing a Queer Clergy for Black Lives Matter conference, conducting hundreds of workshops on LGBTQI+ issues, workers' rights, conflict resolution, de-escalation, and workplace democracy, serving 5 years as the national coordinator of BiNet USA, a national bisexual network, facilitating NGLTF's National Religious Leadership Roundtable for 6 years. Since 2016, they've been a leader in Portland United Against Hate, training over 1,300 Oregonians in interrupting hate in public spaces, speaking at dozens of progressive and radical rallies, and organizing and attending almost every counter rally when white nationalists come to Portland. They are married to Brio and cohabit with Cinnamon, a border collie / St. Bernard. And finally, Tyler Gregory, pronouns are he, him. Ty joined the JCRC in San Francisco as its 5th executive director in April of 2020. He was previously executive director of A Wider Bridge, AWB, a New York-based partner organization of JCRC that is working to advance LGBTQ equality and inclusion in Israel. During his 6 years as deputy director and later executive director of AWB, the organization grew from a Bay Area startup to a leading voice for Jewish and Israel inclusion in the fabric of LGBTQ and progressive America. Before AWB, Gregory spent several years working for the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, APAC, in San Francisco. He's a graduate of UC Davis and a native of San Diego. So we're going to start with Debra Porta, and then Rabbi Kolodny will speak, and before we move to Ty Gregory. So we're going to start with Debra.
Thank you, Rachel. I'm honored to be here. As Rachel mentioned, I'm Debra Porta, the Executive Director for Pride Northwest. We're best known for the annual Portland Pride Festival and Parade, which would normally have happened this previous weekend at the waterfront and across downtown. Obviously, in response to COVID-19, Pride Northwest, along with over 400 Pride organizations across the country and around the world, had to cancel and or postpone their in-person events. It's had a significant impact on the Pride world, and we're still figuring out what that looks like and what the long-term impacts will be. I've been asked to primarily speak about how we've been responding and impacted by COVID and what we're doing this year. And I know that Rabbi Kolodny is going to speak a lot more to Stonewall, which is the event that precipitated the organized Pride marches that began in 1970. Marches had been happening before Stonewall, but they weren't called Pride until after Stonewall. Pride Northwest is a nonprofit organization founded in 1994. Pride celebrations and marches have been happening in Portland since the early to mid 70s. The first march was in 1976, along with the first outdoor festival, which, as folks who organized that event tell me, the most exciting piece of that was recognizing that there was a hot dog vendor on the waterfront. So they felt that they had arrived. Pride has continued to grow since that time. We very much recognize that, as Rachel mentioned, Pride Northwest and Portland Pride have grown into a nationally recognized Pride event because of our size and the quality of what we do. At the same time, in response to COVID, we have, along with other prides, been forced to kind of slow down and really think about who we are as a Pride organization, what Pride represents, where it comes from, what our priorities should be. And so that's what we're working on now. We, along with lots of other Prides, moved into the virtual world. We just had our very first virtual Pride celebration this last weekend, Saturday and Sunday. That was a pretty quick pivot that we had to address and plan for. We're planning a number of other events through the rest of the summer in the virtual world. At this point, we still are not planning any in-person events because of COVID. Being in Multnomah County, their large-scale events of any kind are the last on the list of what's going to be allowed to happen in the future. And so we're honestly anticipating that to be fairly far down the road, which is interesting because one of the biggest concerns that we had when COVID broke and when we recognized that we weren't going to be able to hold the traditional waterfront festival and parade is recognizing that Pride's roots are founded in the visible physical taking of LGBTQ people's rightful place in the public sphere. It's that whole see and be heard, we're here, we're not going anywhere, there are a lot of us. And that's been from day one, the initial purpose of Pride. So there have been lots of concerns about what does it mean for our largest moment of visibility to not happen. What does that mean for the community? What does that mean for our ability to ensure that our voices are heard, that we're listened to, that we're recognized, that we're included, particularly at this time when at the national level, there's a lot happening that's not all that great for our community, notwithstanding yesterday's Supreme Court decision. So we're very aware of that, and aware of the danger that comes with not being able to be as visible as possible during a time when there's a concerted effort to erase us as a people. And we're still grappling with that, in all honesty. We're not really sure what the fallout of that will look like. What we're doing at this point is, as an organization, everything that we can to be visible, to make sure that we're in communication with our partners, with lawmakers, decision makers, influential people, and making sure that our community still maintains the visibility and recognition as a community to be treated fairly and to be included in society. As we've seen throughout history, it's really easy to lose that progress. And Pride Northwest is committed to ensuring that we don't. So that's where our priorities are now, around maintaining visibility, finding opportunities, I should say, for our community to connect with each other, obviously primarily in the virtual world, as well as staying in contact with local policymakers and elected officials around what's happening in our community. Looking down the road, there's a lot of expectation about 2021. And in all honesty, I think we're going to have to get to 2021 before we know what that's going to look like. We all hope that we'll be able to be back together in person. No matter how important or impactful virtual events are, there is nothing that compares to the power of our community being all together in one place at one time. There's nothing that matches that feeling when the parade is going down the street, or when the festival opens, or when the Dykes on Bikes drive by. There's nothing that matches that. I'm not even sure if there's a word for it, but we are hopeful and planning for that and doing the work in the meantime. I think that's probably enough for my introduction or my comments. Obviously, take any questions that anyone has.
Thank you. We're going to pass it over to Rabbi Kolodny.
Hi, everybody. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here. I want to thank the Federation for inviting me, and of course, let everybody know that all that I say are my thoughts and my thoughts alone. So if anyone has some other points of view, we can talk about that during the Q&A. But again, it's beautiful to be here, and I'm not allowed to speak. I have a contract with the Kudsha Brichu, with the Holy One of Blessing, that I have to start with a song. So, we are a gentle, loving people, and we are singing for our lives. We are a gentle, loving people, and we are fighting for our lives. Our rabbinic sages say that we are to learn and replicate the deeds of our ancestors. They call this principle Ma'aseh Avot Siman Labanim, literally, that the actions of our ancestors are a sign or portent to their children. I invite us to learn from a series of deeds that isn't found in Torah, but is part of the legacy of the Avot, the Imahot, the ancestors of the LGBTQI+ movement. Ancestors, even though some of them, of course, are still alive today. On a hot summer night in 1969, police raided the Stonewall Inn in New York City's Greenwich Village, a haven for the city's LGBTQI+ communities. At the time, homosexual acts were illegal in every state except for Illinois, and bars and restaurants could be shut down for having gay employees or serving gay patrons. Police raids on our bars were common before Stonewall. Chronicles tell how police took the opportunity to vent their homophobic rage upon patrons, arresting us with violence, trigger warning, beating men to a pulp, and sometimes viciously raping especially butch women who dared to challenge their image of what a woman should look and act like. I wonder if this sounds familiar to you, but add lethal shooting. To whom is this happening today? On June 27th and 28th, 1969, the Stonewall Inn was packed when 8 plainclothes police officers, 6 men and 2 women, entered. In New York, masquerading as a member of the opposite sex was a crime, so they singled out drag queens and other cross-dressing patrons for arrest. Witnesses say that the crowd erupted after police roughed up a woman dressed in masculine attire who complained that her handcuffs were too tight. People started taunting the officers, yelling pigs and copper, throwing pennies, and then they threw bottles, and some slashed police car tires. Homeless gay youth who viewed the Stonewall as their safe place were at the forefront. 2 transgender women of color, Marcia Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, were said to have resisted arrest and thrown the first bottle, or maybe it was a brick, or maybe it was a stone, at the cops, although Johnson said she arrived later. As the paddy wagon took prisoners to the precinct, a growing mob forced the police to retreat into the bar and barricade themselves inside. And then some protesters used a parking meter as a battering ram to break through the door. And others continued to throw beer bottles and trash and other objects. And some made impromptu firebombs with bottles, matches, and lighter fluid. Sometime after 4 a.m., things quieted down, but more and more supporters showed up, chanting slogans like "Gay Power" and "We Shall Overcome." More police were called to restore order, and they beat and tear-gassed members of the crowd. Thankfully, there were no fatalities. The Gay Liberation Front was formed within weeks, dedicated to no longer cowering in dark corners, but to fighting for civil and human rights, and the world was never the same, although, as Debra just reported, it took until 2 days ago for the Supreme Court to protect our employment rights nationwide. I give you all this detail for a reason. I don't know how many of you have been attending the Black Lives Matter protests, particularly at the Justice Center. I've been to 3 events outside the Justice Center and 3 times to the Justice Center. I don't know if you've seen the police use flashbangs and tear gas and rubber bullets and sonic booms against young people. Some of them are homeless, calling for justice and shaking a fence a little, and throwing bottles into open plazas where no human being stands and none can be hurt, as many of my friends have seen. I don't know if your friends of faith are filming everything, proving all of the above, or if you know legal observers like I do, lawyers themselves out until 2 a.m. every morning to chronicle the unprovoked police violence, once suffering uncontrollable spasms from tear gas that was obviously mixed with nerve gas and being hit by rubber bullets. I do know you don't yet have access to the 30 reports of police brutality that I have collected as part of my work with Portland United Against Hate. A shocking number are from medics who are being targeted along with the press and legal observers, sometimes shot with rubber bullets, sometimes several times a night. I say all this to say that history proves that rising up for justice actually does work. It makes a difference. Getting mad enough at being raped and beaten and killed works. I really want to say there's no good protesters and there are no bad protesters. There are only lovers of freedom and justice who are fighting, fighting for our lives. And today we're not just fighting for our lives, we're fighting for Black lives. Many argue, and I agree, that it is the responsibility of white people to take accountability and to atone in this moment, to fix the evils of systemic racism now and for all time. And the good news is that atonement is available. Atonement and accountability are available. They are available when we refuse to believe the lies of those who use weapons banned in war against justice-seeking citizens. Atonement and accountability are available when we fight for methods and means of community safety that keep Black people safe, not just property and white people. Torah teaches us to welcome, include, lift up, and honor the stranger, the one who is different, maybe from another country, maybe with another skin color, maybe who has a gender identity other than Zachar u'Nekava, male or female. Torah teaches us to welcome the other no fewer than 36 times, and Stonewall teaches that there is a right side and a wrong side of history. Our souls are depending on us being on the right side of history. Have we collectively accepted our obligation to pursue justice? If the last few weeks are any indication, I believe that the majority of us have, certainly here in Portland. Despite whatever fatigue may arise, my hope and my blessing is that we continue our justice work, learning from both Torah and Stonewall, and celebrating this month both Pride and this Friday, Juneteenth, the day the last slaves were freed in 1865, so that we can ensure that this moment is a portal into the beautiful world that Torah calls us to build. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Kolodny. Ty Gregory.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm your visitor from San Francisco. It's a lot easier to come to Portland this way. I want to take a different tack with this and start with a Jewish conversation, and that is that it's very difficult right now for us to maintain a conversation about Jewish peoplehood between the diaspora and Israel. A lot of our opportunities to visit Israel have been dried up. Birthright's been canceled, Hillel trips have been canceled. Israelis equally don't really have an opportunity to come here. And I think that COVID has really sparked some interesting conversations about how it is that we're going to keep this big, messy family together of ours. And I really think that the LGBT community plays an important role in the solution. President Rivlin, Israel's president, likes to talk about the 5 Jewish modern tribes, the 4 tribes of Israel and the 1 diaspora tribe. He talks about the secular tribe based in the heart of Tel Aviv, liberal Tel Aviv. There's the Pride set up behind me, right next to the beach. The Orthodox and Haredi community, who are semi-closed and very traditional. The religious nationalists and the traditional Israelis, those who support the settlements and a greater Israel, and the Arab and Palestinians. And somehow these 4 tribes have to build a shared future together despite their challenges. And of course, the diaspora, which is all of us, the Jewish community in the US and Portland and around the world. Somehow, all of us have to build a shared future, and COVID is making it incredibly difficult for us to come together. But I think the LGBT community is an important place to start because we are in all 5 of these tribes, and the LGBT community comes together across these tribes to work on our shared agenda. So what I want to talk about is some of the issues in each of these tribes and why I think that this is a really motivating place for us to start in coming together during this difficult time. Of course, in the ultra-Orthodox community, young people are having a terrible time coming out still. The homeless youth shelters in Tel Aviv, both the LGBTQ youth shelters and in the broader system, incredibly disproportionate. It's the ultra-Orthodox youth that are coming to the shelters. And there's a lot of important efforts underway to make sure that Orthodox rabbis and community leaders are being educated by the LGBT community, if not necessarily to embrace the community, then to understand that they have members of their community. This isn't just some people marching next to the beach in a secular way, but they're members of their own community that are struggling with this issue. And this is an issue that's at home for them. There are the settlement movement. A lot of people will be surprised to know that I think Israel has done a better job in its political system, making the case among some of the right-wing parties for LGBTQ equality. Israel's first minister, openly gay minister, Amir Ohana, is a member of Likud, Prime Minister Netanyahu's party. And there are, of course, 4 other gay men, not fully representative, but a record number of LGBT members in the Knesset today, but the most senior is from the right. And so they've done a good job, relatively speaking to us, making sure that conservative factions are starting to accept the reality. The Arab and Palestinian population, this is so complicated, especially from a place of shared cooperation between Jews and Arabs, Jews and Palestinians. But similarly, much of the LGBTQ youth in the shelter system are queer Arabs and queer Palestinians. But that's not where it stops, because even in secular Tel Aviv, people like to say, oh, Tel Aviv is the gay capital of the world, the queer capital of the Middle East, what have you. But trans folks are still being attacked on the streets. Those shelters are still full. There's still a need to organize. There's still a need for that 250,000 person march that, like Portland's parade, was canceled this year. And there's even work to do in the heart of Tel Aviv to make sure that marginalized folks, Ethiopians, Arabs, trans folks feel comfortable with who they are. And in the US, in the diaspora, when it comes to this conversation, we also have challenges. And I'm happy to get into this pinkwashing conversation more, but there are those that want to distance us from helping our Israeli LGBTQ brothers and sisters because of the conflict. And I don't think that's fair. I think that this is a real struggle, and we can separate these conversations. We have a lot of work to do, building a shared society, moving towards peace. And the struggle of queer Israelis is very, very real. And those who have met the activists know that we can't put one aside, we can't put one struggle aside for the other. It's not either or, we can do both at the same time. But because LGBTQ folks are in all of these 5 tribes and are working together around a shared table, they can overcome some of those differences between us. As a role model, a starting point for a larger conversation during these difficult times on bridges, bridge building, things that bring us together. Thanks, everybody.
Awesome, thank you. I'm going to invite all our panelists to turn on their videos. And Ty, Liza Milliner, who was actually a participant on that JFNA trip I mentioned, said that you were actually on that trip with them in 2016. So I am going to start with some questions. Let me pull up. And please utilize the Q&A feature. We have a few coming in. So I think this is going to be for our local people here in Portland. Describe the network for LGBTQ plus individuals in Portland and families in Portland. Describe how this network or your particular agency or your interacts with the faith communities, especially the Jewish community, and how. And then this can be for Ty. How are these different or similar in other communities?
Debra, I think you should go first.
You know, I'm not sure if I would say that there's a quote unquote LGBTQ plus network. You know, I would actually say there's not. You know, we have a lot of organizations. I say a lot. We have a few, and they collaborate in some ways, and in some ways not. Portland's LGBTQ plus community interacts with itself very similarly to how the Portland community in general does. It's very site-based, if that's the right phrase. There are communities interspersed who coordinate with each other, connect with each other, that may or may not network with someone that's across town, or that or with an agency, etc. The network, so to speak, of our community actually doesn't match the size of our community when you compare it to other cities and other places with either comparable or close to comparable size communities. When it comes to LGBTQ folks, we actually don't have the network that that we should have.
And I would add that there are some anchor organizations. Pride is one of them. BRO, Basic Rights Oregon, is another. It's an advocacy organization that does a lot of legislative work. And the Q Center, of course, is another, which is a building where lots of events take place and celebrations take place. I would say that if you looked on Meetup, I think that's the app, you know, there would be hundreds of LGBTQI plus meetups, right? And if you go on Facebook, I can tell you there's a PDX Queer Jews group. So that's one place where there's an intersection. I would also say that all but the Orthodox shuls have very active and engaged LGBTQI membership. The Unshul, where I serve, has a particularly high proportion of LGBTQI folks, maybe not surprisingly, given who I am. But all the congregations, as I said, other than the Orthodox, have really thriving queer membership. There is a new Ben the Ark entity, chapter here in Portland that has some queer Jews involved with it. There's queer Jews at the Moishe House. So there's just pretty much anywhere where you see Jews, there's queer people, I think I would say, almost. That's how the intersection happens there. And I agree, we are not networked. I totally agree with what Debra said. In addition, of course, to what Rachel has already mentioned about the Pride activities and ongoing LGBTQI work that the Federation has taken on, which has really been great.
I think they both laid it out well, but I would say in the same way you get 2 Jews and 3 synagogues, the same is true with the queer community. We all like starting new organizations in our community too, and new efforts. And I think that's natural and that's okay. It allows for innovation, it allows for different efforts, it allows for expression. And I think that's something that we should celebrate.
Great, thank you so much. I'm going to follow that up, and this will be more towards Rabbi Kolodny and Ty. In what ways has the Jewish community done well standing up for LGBTQI rights, and in what way have we fallen short?
Well, I guess having run Neharim for a few years, which I don't think was in my bio, Neharim is a Jewish LGBTQI advocacy and retreat organization nationally. It began like 15 or 16 years ago at a time when there were almost no queer Jewish organizations in any city. And by the time I took the helm, there were queer Jewish organizations in every major city, in LA, in New York, in Boston, in DC, and not here in Portland, although, well, there was Keshet. There was Keshet at that time, and then it kind of went into abeyance. So I have seen a trajectory of not much happening for the intersection of queer Jews to an explosion of opportunities in major cities at any rate. We've also seen the emergence of the Talmud study entity, Savra, yeah, is that it? Yeah.
Svara,
thank you. Where Rabbi B'nai Lapé has done amazing things for Talmud study for Jews. So that's all beautiful stuff, which is driven by queer Jews, right? And then the question is, how is the Jewish community at large done with queer Jews? And I think it's really mixed. I think everyone outside the Orthodox world is in a state of acceptance and welcome. And then there's a really broad spectrum of, is it welcome? Of course, we're going to be nice to you. Of course, we want you to be part of the community. Or is there celebration and understanding and appreciation of the specific Torah, for example, that queer Jews have to offer? Is there an interest in leadership development for queer folks? Are queer people being hired to be synagogue rabbis or synagogue directors of education? So I think that there's a spectrum, and that's true in the whole world as well.
Yeah, I think that was a great answer. My institution, the JCRC, Jewish Community Relations Council down here, has been fighting for LGBT rights since the AIDS crisis, since our, mostly our men were dying by the thousands out here in San Francisco. So that goes way back. I think aside from the traditional Orthodox community, we've come a long way, but I think in the same way we're now having an important conversation about Jews of color, the question is, are you just putting a sticker on your door and saying you're welcome? Are you just saying you want to have staff and board members that are from the LGBT community? or from that are Jews of color, or are you willing to accept that there is a deeper level of cultural change required and that you may hear things that you're not yet prepared for? I think people are more likely to encourage, having those people in the tent than setting the table. And it's that setting the table conversation that I think even amongst the most well-intentioned allies that we still need to have in many parts of our community.
Mhm.
Great, thank you. I've got a couple of different ways to go. I'm going to start with Israel, and then I'm going to come back to the States. So I'm going to start with Israel and gay parenting. How have things progressed and regressed in terms of surrogacy, adoption, and support of gay parents specifically in Israel? And I'll preface that by saying we have a large contingency of gay couples that come to Portland for their surrogacy and are lucky enough to have many of them use our mikveh, our community mikveh here in Portland.
Absolutely, and including 2 gay members of Knesset, by the way, that did this in your neck of the woods. Every gay couple and lesbian couple that I know in Tel Aviv talks about Portland. And a lot of the opportunities in other parts of the world for surrogacy have been taken away. This is not an issue without controversy, by the way. This is an issue about women's bodies that continues to be a debate in Israel and other parts of the community. But they've made some strides forward, but there's still not equality. Single people and same-sex gay male couples can still not adopt inside of Israel. There's a discriminatory policy. So there's still a ways to go in terms of family issues in Israel.
Great. And the second is around queer Palestinians. How do you justify Israeli oppression of queer Palestinians? Until you can support the Palestinian right to determination in return, you can't say you are fully representing and supporting queer folks.
Yeah, listen, we have a variety of perspectives of listeners on the call, I'm sure, but let me just say this. Number one, we have to separate out the decision makers in the Knesset and the Prime Minister from the people. The people should not be conflated with the decisions of their government. They have a right to be free. They have a right to have equal rights. And we can fight for Palestinian rights and for LGBTQ equality simultaneously. We don't have to put the needs of LGBTQ Israelis on hold while we're trying to resolve the conflict. Number two, practically speaking, it's the queer folks that are rallying for Palestinian rights in the streets of Tel Aviv. They are among the most progressive of Israelis. They're standing up to their own government to talk about many of these issues. They're the ones going to Black Lives Matter parades in Tel Aviv, demonstrations after Ethiopians are discriminated against by Israeli police. They're the ones that are going to the Palestinian demonstrations. The concept of intersectionality is alive and well amongst the Israeli LGBT community. And I think that in the same way that we as white allies have to educate and talk to ourselves about the issues facing marginalized communities, so do Israelis need to be given the time and space to have that conversation with themselves when it comes to the Palestinians. And that conversation is alive and well in the queer community.
Thank you. I'm going to pivot us back to the United States. We've had a couple of pretty big things that came out in the last 6 days, starting with Trump rolling back transgender healthcare protections on the anniversary of the horrific Pulse shooting. And I was listening to something earlier today that said that really, based on the Supreme Court decision, isn't ultimately going to have a lot of teeth to it. But I'd love to hear from all of you your thoughts around that before we transition a little bit into the Supreme Court decision. So I'll start with the transgender healthcare protections.
I do think that the Supreme Court case probably took all teeth out of that decision, thank God. But this administration does all kinds of things that are not necessarily constitutional or legal. So it's hard to know. And lawsuits have been brought against the administration for violating the Constitution. So it's hard to know how much energy they have behind it.
Rabbi Kolodny speaks to a really important piece that, this administration doesn't actually really care a whole lot about what the Constitution says. And I don't think it really cares a whole lot about its own decisions in some cases. It's how do I put this? I think there's a strategic effort there to, for example, the way that things work, they have a ruling come out. They have an executive order, something, some administrative decision is made, right? And someone is going to have to go sue them to change that or to retract it or whatever the case may be. So there's this whole, lack of a better way to put it, sucking of resources from progressive communities and from real social forwardness that's being sucked into having to consistently, constantly defend ourselves. And, you know, that's a very strategic, that reminds me a lot of the OCA's strategy back in the 90s, late 80s, 90s, around all of the Measure 9 campaigns. There was a very core part of that that consisted of extracting resources from the LGBTQ plus community. And it tires you out after a while. And so I think there's a little bit of a long game happening there, that they're not really all that invested in whether or not it's legal or even that it stands at some point. That's just kind of that's the mechanism they're using in lots of ways to kind of wage this other battle over here around whether it's, I don't like using the word distraction because it's not, because it's very important policy, but there's a strategy there that goes way beyond whether or not they actually care whether they'll be able to implement it or not.
Yeah, I think it's policy terrorism, frankly. You know, they want to keep us terrified. I do want to say about the recent Supreme Court ruling that it was based on the legal theory principle that was pioneered by Chai Feldblum, who's, you might imagine from the name, a Jewish lawyer and a friend of mine. I'm so proud.
So let's talk about that. I have a couple of questions around that. Tell us about what the decision by the Supreme Court that says that Title VII applies to the LGBTQI work protections. What does this mean going forward? And also, can you talk a little bit? I found it interesting that this decision was made with agreement from conservative justices, and the decision was written by Neil Gorsuch. Yeah. Speak to the timing and that this is happening right now.
So, oh, Tyler, go ahead. I've spoken already.
Sure. Listen, I think that they know which way history is trending. I think in Gorsuch's case, he knew which way history was trending, wanted to be on the right side of history. There's no proof to this theory that they wanted to let some of the tension in American society out, like a valve, an escape valve for some of the tension in society. I don't think that we should allow that to work, but it seemed timed that way to me. And listen, I think our community is great about taking a legal route, but there's also a societal and a cultural route. And just because we've had these major legal milestones come forward doesn't mean that there's not a lot of cultural change required and enforcement required. We still have to go out and educate people. We still have to talk outside of our bubble, our comfortable bubble, with people who don't think like us. So legal advancement is a necessity, but it's by no means sufficient.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that. And there's another tie-in to, the Black Lives Matter movement today and to anti-racism work. The passage of the Civil Rights Act, didn't stop racism. It didn't stop interpersonal racism. It didn't stop systemic racism. It didn't transform our culture nearly as much as we might have hoped. And what's true about this decision is that it gives people who are fired or not hired or not promoted a legal cause of action. It can't prevent the firing or the discriminatory failure to hire or failure to promote, right? And so it basically, it's necessary and fabulous, but there's still the burden on the person who was harmed to secure legal counsel, to find funding to fight the fight. And the truth is there's so much more work to do on the culture wars front, to basically transform consciousness so that people will be seen not only as welcomed in the same paradigm as the Jewish community, right, but as valued for the unique contribution that they have to make to the workplace.
I would just add that one of the things that that comes out of decisions like this for a lot of people who aren't consistently paying attention is where the sense of comfort comes from. It's like, oh, okay, we've arrived. We got the thing, is Civil Rights Act. Who would have thought that, less than a generation later, most of that was gutted. And there's a consistent gutting of any of this major kind of legislation that tends to pass, especially through the Supreme Court. And so the concern is taking the victory and then going home, when really that legal decision, that moment, may be the culmination of lots of years of work, but it's only the beginning of keeping it. That's the way that any significant change in this country has never simply just stayed once it's been achieved. It has to be fought for. And if we look back, every significant progress that's been made on some level, there's been some chipping away of it because we aren't paying attention to it.
Yeah, if you look at the marriage equality case, that was, we all went out into the streets when that happened to celebrate. But what ended up happening is they decided that the most vulnerable amongst our community were the trans community, and they went after them hard. And certainly this health decision is part of that. And so I think that while marriage was a galvanizing force for the movement over decades, it didn't come without consequence. And as a result, many of our trans community members are suffering because some people decided to pack up and go home. I'm sort of opening the internal community kimono here by talking about this, but it's really not right that some people felt that they could take their chips home after that fight was won. And I think we're still paying for that. We really need to educate our community that this is just the start. This legal victory is just the start.
So along those lines, with marriage equality passing and with the Supreme Court ruling and needing to stay on top of those and making sure they stay, what are some of the other next legislative or legal battles do you see to safeguard the LGBTQ rights?
I think at the national level, I'll confess I'm an attorney, but I haven't been a practicing attorney for a very long time. The Trump administration has gutted the right to serve in the military. So while I wish we didn't have a military, the fact is that we do. And so that's one arena that's calling out for redress. Immigration law, the ability for people who are married to people who are same gender partners is under great duress, as well as refugee status for those who are at risk for being, killed or harmed if they stay in their current country. But that's true because all immigration law and all refugee law is under attack. And I would also say that this is both a national and state issue, but the degree of hate violence, especially against Black trans women, but against all trans people, is just incredibly disproportionate to their numbers in the population. And remedies should be found both at the federal and state and local levels.
I would add education to that, and access to education and access to safe education is a big one. There, Betsy, is that her name? She's flying under the radar a lot. There is so much undermining of particularly the protecting of trans and non-binary students that has happened in the last couple of years. And again, they get sued. And so maybe it goes into effect, maybe it doesn't, but the rulings come down. And, when you're talking about education, the guidance, that's what they call it. And by the time a court case has been heard or not heard, you've got school districts across the United States who have already implemented the changes made that directly impact LGBTQ+ students, both K-12 as well as in higher ed. I think there's huge impact happening there that I don't think we're paying enough attention to, that has potential for long-term impact, especially in the K-12 world.
Yeah, I'm sure the three of us could riff on the issues all day. I'll add in three more. Number one is the issues of LGBTQ seniors. Some of them go to retirement homes and have to go back in the closet because the people running it or the staff don't have the core competency or training to support those folks. That's becoming a major issue as for the first time, a widely out generation are retiring and entering a new phase of life. Number two, homelessness. In our city in San Francisco, more than half of homeless youth are LGBTQ identified. The numbers are similar across the country and frankly around the world. And in our book in San Francisco, that's at the top of the list. And third is rural America. You know, we're very lucky to live in deep blue states with supportive governments at every level, largely, not completely. But we have people without the resources, without the community centers, without the peer support in rural parts of our country that are struggling immensely despite these legal advancements. So those are three more issues that I would consider.
And I'll jump in with one more, and that is that the degree of mental health diagnosis in the LGBTQI+ community and suicide is higher than the population at large because of the discrimination, hate, oppression, lack of support from parents when coming out, et cetera, et cetera. And while I don't have a specific piece of legislation that I think we need to be pursuing at the federal level to address that, it is a core issue. And I just want to say that the numbers for folks who identify as bi or pansexual are worse than, shockingly, anyone else. And in part, that's because they are often alienated and feel disconnected from and dismissed from both lesbian and gay folks and straight folks. So, and that's very under addressed. It's well researched, but the response is very under addressed. Yeah.
Thank you. I want to pivot. We are living through very fraught times with the racial tensions right now. And I want to ask a couple of questions specifically related to that before we finish up. Audre Lorde wrote that there is no hierarchy of oppression, that the same forces are at play in racism, sexism, and homophobia. Do you agree with that? What are your thoughts on priorities and/or intersectionality of oppression right now?
I guess I'll take that one first. Listen, I think that white supremacy is largely the root of everything you described. I think that they manifest differently, but they have a similar root. We have to understand how they manifest. And I actually want to take this in the Jewish direction to say that Jewish oppression happens regardless of privilege. We get attacked for having too much privilege. We get attacked for not having enough privilege. And that manifests differently. And I think, to your question, I think that we have a difficult time, particular white Ashkenazi Jews, we have a very difficult time navigating this conversation because we do benefit from privilege in the world because of our skin tone. We don't walk into a grocery store with those concerns, but we still live with anti-Semitism every day. So I think we have a lot of work to do inside of our community to sort of become more conscious of how we sit in this system, understanding anti-Semitism is a part of white supremacy in this country, but also recognize that there are other communities that are suffering more acutely than us in this very moment. And we need to put aside many of our concerns around BDS that have been brought up within the Black Lives Matter movement. Black Lives Matter is an idea, it's a movement. Yes, it's also a constellation of organizations, a couple of which have endorsed BDS. That's no reason to step aside. We have to do this because it's the right thing. And whatever issues that we have right now, now's not the time to air them. We really have to be able to support our Black brothers and sisters in this moment.
Yeah, I want to expand on that and say that I'm definitely not into people playing the oppression Olympics, like vying for who is most oppressed. However, I do think in this country, for the past 400 years, the horrors and of slavery and the very slow genocide of Black people in this country rise to a level that puts anti-Black racism in a category of its own. So I love Audre Lorde. And I remember for years, everybody in all my activist circles preaching this no hierarchy of oppression construct. But yeah, I actually do think white supremacy is an evil unto its own. One could say that misogyny is the root cause of homophobia and other kinds of oppression, because women and Black people are often kind of cast in that same otherized way by white men and who are propertied and empowered. But it doesn't matter to me. Like, I don't need to have that conversation in this moment. Addressing racism and white supremacy is of the utmost importance. And unlearning our racism, because all of us who are white have internalized it.
I would have to agree that, like, Audre Lorde's, that reference to Audre Lorde's statement, I think in a lot of ways is often weaponized to become an excuse for not actually setting a priority of one kind or another. And there's nothing about her that tells me that that was the intent. I think Rabbi Kolodny is correct that in this country, at least, there is a very specific experience that the Black community has had that isn't matched by any other community. I also want to say that that also includes Black LGBTQ plus folks. That, you know, we often talk about the LGBTQ plus community as if it's separate somehow from anyone, but there is no such thing as a community or society anywhere without us in it. So there is no, it's not about LGBTQ plus rights and Black rights, et cetera, et cetera. These are they're very intertwined. And I think the approach has to be intertwined as well. But to the point about the Black experience in this country, it's one of those, how do I say it? If we're able to significantly address our racist history when it comes to the Black community and address the inequalities and the oppressive system put in place to control that community, then I think a lot of other oppressive moments, oppressive experiences on the part of other communities will be addressed as well, because everyone else is a little step up from there. And so if that's addressed, that will automatically spill over into other communities. I also don't have any use for the Oppression Olympics, but I also don't think it can be used to decide that everything is equal and that it's all, there is a difference. There is a distinct difference.
Amen. I just want to add, in terms of intersectionality, one could say that Christian supremacy is at the root of a lot of this. It's certainly at the root of white nationalism. And as Eric Ward teaches in his Skin in the Game article, anti-Semitism is what animates white nationalism, and white nationalism comes out of Christian supremacy, as does colonialism, which was the driving force for slavery. So not that I want to sit here and diss Christians, but I'm just saying, if you want to find an intersectional hook, there's one.
So we are right at time, but I just want to end on a little bit of a positive note. And what's something right now, given everything that's going on, that's giving you a little bit of hope? And we'll just do a quick go round. Just what are you seeing right now that is hopeful for you?
I'll start. I'll just say, I think the last month has resulted in incredible advances and moving to end systemic racism and white supremacy, particularly around how police systems operate, tearing down statutes, tearing down statues. I am very optimistic.
I'd have to say the thing that makes me the most optimistic is because of the scale of what's happened in the last month, that what I see happening are Black voices refusing to be silenced anymore, in all kinds of different arenas. You know, you mentioned the tearing down of statues and that sort of thing, which is absolutely something that has to happen. But it's the empowerment behind the push for those that I think is more telling, and what I'm hearing from those voices, and the refusal to just simply let things happen anymore, I think is the thing that's most impactful for me right now.
Yeah. You know, the thing that frustrates me most about any civil rights issue is that people only talk amongst themselves that are already supportive. I think social media has amplified that trend. And what we've seen in the polls with Black Lives Matter now overwhelmingly supported, it must mean that people are daring to be uncomfortable, and vice versa, that they're willing to sit uncomfortably and have a conversation that they weren't previously ready to hear. And so I think that people learning to be uncomfortable is leading to the kind of inspiring change that we're seeing right now. And that's what gives me hope.
Wonderful. Thank you, Debra. Thank you, Rabbi Kolodny and Ty, for sharing with us today. And thank you for our audience for joining us. We look forward to having you join us next week. We're going to hear from Rabbi Jonathan Slater, a senior program director at the Institute for Jewish Spirituality. So again, thank you, everyone. And thank you for all the work that you are doing.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Great to be here with all of you. Thanks.